The hum of the city was a distant, irrelevant thing from the 50th floor. From his throne of leather and polished steel, Quan Jinwu surveyed the sprawling neon-lit veins of Seoul, not with pride, but with the detached analysis of a general studying a map of conquered territory. Every glowing skyscraper, every river of headlights, represented an asset, a liability, or a target. His world was one of numbers, of leverage, of calculated violence masked by corporate legitimacy. At 31, he commanded an empire built from the shadows his father had carved, and he wore the responsibility like a perfectly tailored, soul-crushingly heavy suit. His penthouse office was a reflection of his inner landscape, vast, silent, and impeccably clean, with not a single object out of place to suggest warmth or spontaneity. A single, priceless bonsai tree sat on a marble pedestal, its gnarled branches meticulously pruned, a living thing forced into unnatural perfection, a metaphor he chose to ignore. He signed the last page of a contract that would quietly bankrupt a rival shipping company, his calligraphy pen scratching against the thick paper with a sound like ice cracking. There was no satisfaction in it, only the quiet finality of a problem solved. He felt the familiar emptiness settle in his chest, the constant companion that no amount of wealth or power could exorcise. His life was a fortress, and he was its solitary prisoner. The door chimed softly, and his right-hand man, Park Min-jun, entered without waiting for an answer, his usual composure completely gone. Min-jun's hair was disheveled, and his face was pale with the kind of panic Jinwoo only ever saw during a botched smuggling operation. "Hyung," Min-jun breathed, closing the door and leaning against it. "I have a problem." A huge 1-inch Jinwoo didn't look up from the contract. "If it involves the Incheon port, I've already handled it. Their primary distributor is now ours." Min-jun shook his head frantically.
No, not that. It's
personal. It's my mother. She set me up on a blind date. Tonight. And just so found out, Jinwoo finally looked up, his eyebrow arching with faint, contemptuous amusement. A blind date. How quaint. Let me guess, the daughter of some construction magnate she wants you to marry?
worse.
The niece of her best friend from university. They've been planning this for a year. I can't cancel. But if I go, just so will literally kill me. She thinks I'm having dinner with you to discuss quarterly reports. Jinwoo leaned back, the leather creaking in the silence. He loathed the very concept. A forced meeting based on flimsy connections and parental ambition. It was everything he despised about the world outside his own controlled reality. Messy, emotional, and inefficient. That sounds like a personal failing, Min-jun. Not my concern, please, Hyung, Min-jun pleaded, taking a step forward. Just go in my place. Just for an hour. Her name is Zola. Tell her you're an architect. That's what my mother told her. Say it didn't work out. Be your usual charming self. She'll be so intimidated she'll leave in 10 minutes. Jinwoo's expression hardened. The idea of pretending to be someone else, of engaging in such a transparently pathetic social ritual, was galling. He was about to deliver a cold, final refusal when Min-jun played his last card. The Cheongdam-dong property. The one you've been trying to acquire. Her uncle is the holdout on the city council. If you do this for me, I'll make sure he has a very compelling reason to vote in your favor next week. The offer hung in the air, a piece of raw meat tossed into his sterile world. It was a transaction. A simple, clean exchange. This he understood. He stared out the window, at the cold, indifferent city lights. 1 hour of pointless conversation for a multi-million-dollar real estate deal. The math was simple. Fine, Jinwoo said, his voice flat. Send me the details. But you owe me, Min-jun. And my debts are expensive. He felt a profound sense of disgust, not at Min-jun, but at himself, for agreeing to participate in a world of feelings and connections, even as a lie. The address led him not to one of the Michelin-starred, minimalist restaurants he frequented, but to a small, quiet neighborhood tucked away from the main thoroughfares. The cafe, named Serendipity, was nestled between a flower shop and a bookstore, its windows glowing with a warm, honeyed light that seemed to push back against the chilly autumn evening. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans, old paper, and something sweet, like cinnamon. Soft jazz trickled from hidden speakers, and the low murmur of conversation was a stark contrast to the echoing silence of his office. For a moment, Jin-woo felt a dizzying sense of dislocation, as if he had stepped through a portal into another reality. His tailored suit and polished Italian shoes felt absurdly out of place among the patrons in their comfortable sweaters and worn jeans. This world was not made of chrome and glass. It was made of worn wood, mismatched chairs, and shelves overflowing with books. It was a world of comfort, not of power. He scanned a room, his eyes automatically assessing exits and potential threats, a habit he couldn't break. Then he saw her. She was sitting at a small table by the window, a book lying open in front of her. She was looking out at the street, a faint, thoughtful smile on her lips. She was an island of stunning color in the muted cafe. A sleeveless dress the color of deep twilight, a rich, royal purple that seemed to absorb the light and glow from within. Her skin was the color of rich, dark earth, and a cascade of intricate braids was piled elegantly atop her head. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The sight of her was not a gentle surprise. It was a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that momentarily stole the air from his lungs. He had expected someone forgettable, someone easy to dismiss. This woman was the opposite of forgettable. He felt an immediate, illogical surge of possessive anger that she was here for Min-jun, even a fake Min-jun. He straightened his tie, the silk a familiar constriction around his throat, and began the walk to her table. Each step felt deliberate, a march into enemy territory. His plan was simple: be cold, be brief, and be gone. He would crush this little arrangement with polite, surgical indifference, and be back in his own world before the hour was up. He stopped at her table. She looked up, and her eyes, large and dark and intelligent, met his. The faint smile on her lips widened into something genuine and luminous. "Min-jun?" she asked, her voice a low, melodic hum that vibrated through the air between them. It was a sound that was both soft and strong, like velvet stretched over steel. He found his own voice caught in his throat. His carefully constructed plan, his practiced coldness, all of it seemed to evaporate under the warmth of her gaze. He was Kwon Jin-woo, a man who controlled boardrooms and back alleys with the same icy precision. But in that moment, looking at a woman named Zola in a purple dress, he forgot his lines. The name he was supposed to use, the identity he was supposed to assume, felt like a cheap costume. All he could do was nod, the motion feeling stiff and unnatural as his mind raced to catch up with the sudden, violent beating of his own heart. This was not a transaction. This was a complication. He slid into the chair opposite her, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. He placed his hands on the table, lacing his fingers together in a gesture of control that he did not feel. His internal monologue was a chaotic storm of analysis and disbelief. He catalogued her features, the elegant line of her jaw, the gentle curve of her lips, the way the soft cafe light caught the subtle silver threads in her braids. He was searching for a flaw, a crack in the facade, some sign of the avarice or ambition that motivated every other person he knew. He found nothing but a placid sincerity that was as unnerving as it was captivating. "You are Zola," he stated, his voice coming out flatter than he intended. It was a statement, not a question. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "I am. And you're Park Min-jun, the architect.
Your mother has told my aunt so much about you.
She says you build skyscrapers that touch the clouds." Jin-woo felt a flicker of irritation at Min-jun's fabricated life. An architect. A builder. It was so pathetically noble. He decided to lean into the lie, to use its inherent dullness to his advantage. "I design buildings," he confirmed, his tone clipped. "It's a job of angles and measurements. Concrete and steel." He hoped the cold, technical description would create a distance between them, a chasm of boredom she would be eager to escape. But she only tilted her head, her curiosity genuine. It must be amazing to imagine something so huge in your mind and then watch it become real. To create a space where thousands of people will live their lives, fall in love, have children. You're not just building with concrete. You're building the backdrop for memories. Her perspective was so utterly alien. He had always seen his acquisitions in terms of square footage, profit margins, and strategic dominance. She saw homes. She saw life. The conversation he had intended to suffocate was suddenly breathing on its own. He found himself asking questions, not as a tactic, but because he was inexplicably compelled to understand the workings of her mind. "And what is it that you do, Zola?" he asked, the name feeling strangely intimate on his tongue. "Oh, nothing nearly as grand," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm a caregiver for an elderly woman in this neighborhood during the day. And in the evenings, I volunteer at the community garden just down the street. We grow vegetables for the local food bank." A caregiver. A volunteer. Her life was built on service, on giving without expectation of return. It was a concept so foreign to his world of ruthless quid pro quo that he struggled to process it. In his circles, altruism was a weakness to be exploited. For her, it seemed to be a source of profound strength. "That doesn't sound very profitable," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them, a reflexive jab from his cynical worldview. He expected her to be offended, but she just smiled that same, unnervingly genuine smile. "Profit isn't always measured in one, is it?" Seeing Mrs. Kim's face light up when I read to her, or watching a child taste a tomato they helped grow for the first time. That's a different kind of wealth. The kind that actually keeps you warm at night for the first time in over a decade. Kwon Jin-woo was silent. He had no counterargument. His own wealth, vast as it was, had never once kept him warm. It was a cold, hard shield, and he was beginning to feel the chill of it seep into his bones. The hour Min-jun had requested bled into two. Jin-woo found himself held captive not by obligation, but by a reluctant fascination. He listened as Zola spoke about her life, a tapestry woven from threads of community, empathy, and simple joys. She described the stubborn resilience of the kale in the community garden, the intricate stories the elderly woman she cared for would tell, the pleasure of finding a first-edition book in a dusty second-hand shop. Her world was small, yet it seemed infinitely larger and more vibrant than his own sprawling, sterile empire. He, in turn, maintained his flimsy cover as Min-jun the architect, speaking of load-bearing walls and zoning regulations, trying to keep his language as gray and uninteresting as possible. Yet, Zola found color even in his monochrome descriptions, finding poetry in structural integrity and humanity in urban planning. It was maddening. He felt as if she was seeing through the facade, not to the Mafia boss beneath, but to a man he himself had never met, a man who could create things of beauty rather than just acquire or destroy them. When the waitress finally came to announce they were closing, the spell was broken. The real world, with its demands and its dangers, rushed back in. He paid the bill in cash, a thick wad of notes that made the young waitress's eyes go wide, a small but telling sign of the gulf between their realities. He walked her out into the cool night air. The street was quiet now, the earlier bustle having settled into a sleepy calm. "I should get to my bus," she said, pulling a light cardigan around her shoulders. The bus. Of course. His own car, a custom black sedan with bullet-resistant windows, was parked a block away, a sleeping panther of obscene wealth and violence. The contrast was a chasm. He should have let her go. He should have said a polite, final goodbye and disappeared from her life, a strange, socially awkward architect she would soon forget. That was the logical, self-preservative thing to do. But logic had deserted him the moment he saw her. "I can give you a ride," he offered, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. "Oh, no, you don't have to do that. The bus stop is right there, it's no trouble," he insisted, a part of him desperate to extend their time together, another part morbidly curious to see her reaction to his world, even just the polished leather interior of his car. But she just shook her head, her smile gentle but firm. "Thank you, Min-jun, but I'm fine. I enjoyed our conversation." She turned to leave, and a primitive panic seized him. He couldn't let it end like this. But the protocols of his life, the carefully constructed walls of his personality, prevented him from asking for her number or suggesting another meeting. It would be a breach of his own rigid code. He simply watched her walk to the brightly lit bus shelter, her purple dress a beacon in the darkness. He waited until the bus arrived with a hiss of its air brakes, watched her silhouette board, and then watched the bus pull away, its red tail lights shrinking until they were swallowed by the night. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the cold seeping through his expensive suit. He drove back to his penthouse, the silence of the car a roaring accusation. He strode into the vast living space, the floor-to-ceiling windows displaying the glittering, indifferent city he owned. He poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid doing nothing to quell the turmoil inside him. He felt hollowed out, as if she had taken something with her, or worse, as if she had shown him the vast emptiness that was already there. When Minjun called, Jin-woo answered with a guttural bark.
Well,
How did it go? Was it awful? It was a waste of time. Jin-woo lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Consider your debt paid. He hung up before Minjun could reply, cutting off the connection to the world that had led him to her. He downed the whiskey in one go, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. But it was useless. He could still hear her laugh, still see the warmth in her eyes, still feel the seismic shock of her simple, profound sincerity. The fortress was breached. In the days that followed, Jin-woo plunged himself back into his world with a vengeance. He was a creature of darkness and control, and he would smother the memory of her light with the familiar shadows of his work. He orchestrated a hostile takeover of a tech startup, his methods so swift and brutal that the company's board didn't know what had happened until he was sitting in their chairman's office. He visited the Incheon port, walking the docks as his men unloaded contraband under the cloak of legitimate cargo, his presence alone a guarantee of silence and efficiency. The scent of salt and diesel, the clanging of metal, the sight of fear in the eyes of his underlings. This was his reality. It was ugly, it was violent, and it was real. Zola, with her community gardens and her stories, was a dream, a dangerous fantasy he could not afford. Yet, her memory was a persistent ghost. During a tense negotiation with a rival faction, as their leader postured and threatened, Jin-woo found his mind drifting to her description of a stubborn tomato plant. As he signed off on a multi-million won-wire transfer, he thought of her words. Profit isn't always measured in one. The dissonance was becoming unbearable. His world, which had once felt so solid and absolute, now seemed brittle and transparent. He could see right through its gilded cage to the emptiness within. The harder he worked to forget her, the more vividly she appeared in his thoughts. He started noticing things. The taste of his morning coffee, the precise shade of the sky at dawn, the sound of rain against his window. His senses, long dulled by routine and cynicism, were slowly, painfully reawakening. The ghost of her was everywhere, tinting his monochrome world with color. The breaking point came a week after the blind date. He was in a meeting, staring at a projected spreadsheet of extortion profits, and he felt nothing. Not power, not satisfaction, not even the cold pragmatism that usually guided him. He felt only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He stood up in the middle of the presentation, earning shocked looks from his capos. "The meeting is over," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. He couldn't do it anymore. The lie of his life was too heavy to bear. He drove for hours with no destination, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. He was being pulled by an invisible string, a magnetic force he no longer had the strength or the will to resist. He knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he had to see her again. Using his resources was a simple matter. He didn't need to dig into her private life. She had already told him where to find her. The community garden. It felt like a violation to use his clandestine network to locate a place so pure, but it was the only way he knew. The next afternoon, he found himself parked a block away from a small, fenced-in patch of green nestled between two aging apartment buildings. He got out of his car, his suit feeling like a suit of armor, completely alien in this neighborhood of laughing children and laundry lines strung between balconies. He walked to the entrance of the garden.
It was a riot of life.
Elderly women tended to neat rows of lettuce, teenagers watered sunflowers that towered over them, and a group of small children were chasing butterflies. And in the center of it all was Zola. She was on her knees in the dirt, wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt, her hair tied back in a colorful scarf. She was showing a little girl how to properly hold a watering can, her face alight with a patient, radiant joy. The sight of her, so at home, so vibrant and alive, rooted him to the spot. He was a shadow at the edge of her sunlit world, a blight on this small paradise. Everything in him screamed to turn around, to get back in his armored car and drive away, to leave her untouched by the filth of his existence. But his feet wouldn't move. He had spent his entire life taking what he wanted through force and intimidation. But for the first time, he wanted something he couldn't conquer, something he could only earn. He watched her for a long time, a silent observer from a world away. Then, taking a breath that felt like his first, he pushed open the small wooden gate and took a step inside. He was no longer Kwon Jinwoo, the boss. He wasn't even Min Jun, the architect. He was just a man, lost and broken, walking toward the only real thing he had found. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, shielding the small plant from the afternoon sun. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, followed by a slow, dawning recognition. Her smile was more hesitant this time, laced with surprise. "Min Jun?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the gentle breeze that rustled through the corn stalks behind her. He felt the name like a physical blow, a reminder of the lie that stood between them. This had to be the first thing he corrected. The foundation of whatever this was, whatever he hoped it could be, had to be built on a sliver of truth, even if it was the only one he could offer. "My name is not Min Jun," he said, the confession feeling like he was pulling a splinter from his own soul. "My name is Kwon Jinwoo." He watched her face for any sign of alarm or anger, bracing himself for the rejection he deserved. Instead, her brow simply furrowed with a gentle curiosity. She rose to her feet, brushing the dark, rich soil from her hands onto her jeans. She was taller than he had realized, standing before him not with intimidation, but with a calm, centered presence that made him feel like the one who was off balance. "Kwon Jinwoo," she repeated, tasting the name, letting it settle in the air between them. "Why would you tell me you were someone else?" He had a dozen prepared excuses, all tied to corporate espionage or complicated business rivalries, lies built upon lies. But looking into her clear, unwavering eyes, he found he couldn't utter them. He opted for a partial truth, the most he could manage. It was a favor for a friend. A stupid, complicated one. He was supposed to be here, not me. "I apologize for the deception." He expected suspicion, a wall to go up. But Zola simply studied his face for a long moment, her gaze analytical but not unkind. It was as if she were looking past the expensive suit and the rehearsed apology, searching for the man underneath. "Well, Kwon Jinwoo," she said finally, a small, genuine smile returning to her lips. "It's nice to meet you properly. I'm Zola." She extended her soil-dusted hand. He stared at it, this offering of peace and acceptance. His own hands were clean, manicured, and stained with things he could never wash away. To take hers felt like a transgression, a soiling of her purity with his corruption. But to refuse would be a greater insult. He slowly reached out and took her hand. Her grip was firm, her skin warm and slightly rough from her work. The contact sent a jolt through him, an electric current of simple, human connection that was more potent than any power he had ever wielded. It was grounding, real. He didn't let go immediately, holding on for a moment longer than necessary, absorbing the warmth, the life in her touch. "Why are you here?" she asked, gently withdrawing her hand. He looked around at the vibrant chaos of the garden, at the life teeming in every corner. I'm not sure," he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. "I just knew I had to be." He began to visit the garden regularly. At first, he would stand at the edge, a silent sentinel in a dark suit, watching her work. He told himself it was a tactical observation, an assessment of a variable that had entered his carefully controlled life equation. But it was a lie. He was there because the sight of her, covered in dirt and sunlight, was the only thing that made the crushing emptiness of his own existence bearable. Zola, for her part, accepted his strange, silent presence with an easy grace. She would look up, offer him a warm smile of acknowledgement, and then return to her work, never pressuring him to speak or participate. She gave him space, an unspoken permission to simply be. One sweltering afternoon, she was struggling to move a heavy bag of fertilizer. He watched for a moment as she strained, her muscles tight with the effort. Without a second thought, he took off his jacket, folded it meticulously over the fence post, and walked over. "Allow me," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He lifted the bag with an ease born from a life of disciplined physical training, the weight of it nothing compared to the burdens he usually carried. He placed it where she indicated, a cloud of earthy dust puffing into the air. "Thank you, Jinwoo," she said, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to," he replied, and it was the truest thing he had said in years. That small act broke the dam. He started helping, first with heavy lifting, then with weeding, then with watering. He was clumsy and out of his element, his movements stiff and unnatural among the fluid, organic rhythms of the garden. But Zola was a patient teacher, showing him how to distinguish a weed from a seedling, how to test the soil for moisture. He learned that he was not creating order from chaos, but rather participating in an order that had always existed, one that was far more powerful and resilient than his own. During these afternoons, they talked. He learned about her childhood in a small village, about her dream of one day opening a small library cafe, a place where people could find nourishment for both their minds and their bodies. She learned about his stressful corporate job, the long hours, the constant pressure. He carefully edited the details, painting a portrait of a lonely executive, not a crime lord. But even in his edited version, she heard the truth of his isolation. "You know," she said one day, as they sat on a wooden bench shelling peas, "a plant can't grow if it's kept in a box in the dark. It doesn't matter how rich the soil is. It needs sunlight. It needs air." The metaphor was so simple, so direct, that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was the plant in the box, his wealth the rich but useless soil. He looked at her, at the way the sun caught in her hair, and felt a desperate, aching need for the light she so effortlessly embodied. He finally asked her to dinner. Not as a transaction, not as a favor, but as Kwon Jinwoo. He chose the venue with painstaking care, rejecting the opulent, soulless restaurants he usually used for business. He settled on a quiet, elegant place with a private garden courtyard, a compromise between her world and his. When he picked her up, he was stunned. She had traded her work jeans for a simple, flowing black dress that shimmered subtly under the streetlights. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and a pair of delicate silver earrings were her only adornment. She was still Zola, but now her earthy beauty had been polished to a breathtaking radiance. He, in turn, felt like an imposter in his own expensive clothes. He helped her into his car, the scent of her perfume, something light and floral, like jasmine, filling the sterile leather interior. The ride was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with a nervous, crackling energy. At the restaurant, he watched her, fascinated. She was not intimidated by the hushed atmosphere or the hovering waiters. She looked around with genuine curiosity, her eyes taking in the art on the walls, the candlelit tables, the soft music drifting from the courtyard. She moved through his world with the same unshakable self-possession she had in the garden. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice a soft melody over the clink of silverware. "It feels peaceful." He had never once thought of this place, or any place like it, as peaceful. For him, they were arenas for power plays, stages for negotiations. She was teaching him to see his own world through a new lens. The conversation flowed more easily than it ever had. Away from the garden, he felt a strange freedom to speak about the pressures of his life, Couching his criminal enterprise in the vague language of family business, he spoke of the weight of his father's legacy, of the constant expectation to be stronger, more ruthless than his competitors. He didn't realize how much he was revealing until he saw the look of profound empathy in her eyes. "It sounds incredibly lonely," she said, her perception cutting straight to the heart of the matter. All that pressure to be a fortress. But even fortresses need a window, or they become prisons. He felt his own walls tremble. She wasn't just hearing his words, she was hearing the truth beneath them. He found himself wanting to tell her everything, to confess the entire ugly truth of his existence, just to see if her compassion could possibly extend to a man like him. But fear held him back. The risk was too great. Instead, he changed the subject, asking her about the books she loved, the places she dreamed of seeing. He wanted to fill his mind with her light, to push the darkness back, even just for a few hours. As he drove her home, a gentle rain began to fall, the drops streaking across the windshield like liquid diamonds. He pulled up to her modest apartment building and killed the engine. Neither of them moved. "I had a wonderful time, Jin-woo," she said, turning to him. In the dim light of the dashboard, her eyes seemed to hold the entire night sky. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently cupped her cheek. Her skin was incredibly soft. His thumb stroked her jawline, and he felt her lean into his touch, her breath catching softly. "I did too," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't. She met him halfway, and their lips touched. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of discovery. It was soft, tentative, and filled with all the unspoken things that hung between them. It tasted of rain and hope and a future he had never believed he could have. It was, in a word, everything. Their relationship deepened in the weeks that followed, becoming a secret garden of its own, a fragile ecosystem of stolen moments and quiet intimacies. They built a routine. Afternoons spent in the real garden, their hands in the earth, and evenings spent exploring the city. He took her to concerts in grand halls, and she took him to tiny, hole-in-the-wall restaurants where the owners knew her by name. Each outing was a study in contrasts, a deliberate weaving of their two disparate worlds. Jin-woo found himself changing. The cold, analytical part of his brain, the part that calculated risk and profit, was being slowly colonized by thoughts of her. He would be in the middle of threatening a business rival, and his mind would wander to the sound of her laugh. He started delegating more of the unsavory aspects of his work to Minjun, creating pockets of time that he could dedicate solely to Zola. He was living a dangerous double life, and the strain was beginning to show. He was more hesitant to use violence, more inclined to find peaceful solutions, a shift that did not go unnoticed by his lieutenants. But the peace he felt with Zola was a more powerful drug than the adrenaline of his old life. She was his sanctuary. The conflict he had been dreading arrived on a crisp Saturday evening, dressed in couture and dripping with disdain. He had taken Zola to a charity auction for a new wing of the city's art museum, an event he was expected to attend and generously support. He hated these functions, the preening socialites and their thinly veiled greed, but he wanted Zola to see the beautiful art. As they were admiring a large abstract painting, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the air. "Jin-woo, darling. I didn't think I'd see you at something so pedestrian." He froze. He knew that voice. He turned slowly to see Baek-yuna, the daughter of a rival syndicate leader and a woman to whom he had once been briefly, disastrously engaged. Yuna was everything Zola was not. Her beauty was sharp and cold, her smile was a weapon, and her eyes were like chips of ice. She looked Zola up and down, her expression a perfect mask of polite contempt. "And who is this?" Yuna asked, her gaze dismissing Zola's simple but elegant dress as if it were a rag. "Don't tell me you've developed a taste for charity cases." Jin-woo felt a murderous rage rise in his chest, hot and swift. He instinctively stepped slightly in front of Zola, a protective gesture he couldn't suppress. "Yuna," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is Zola. She is with me." Zola, however, did not shrink under Yuna's venomous gaze. She simply met it with a calm, unwavering dignity that seemed to infuriate Yuna even more. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Zola said, her voice even and warm, a stark contrast to Yuna's icy tone. Yuna laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Oh, he's found a polite one. How refreshing. Tell me, Zola, does he ever tell you about his work? About the family business? About all the little messes he has to clean up to afford places like this?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or does he just pretend to be a prince, buying you pretty things until you're too comfortable to ask the right questions?" Every word was a poison dart aimed at the heart of their fragile relationship. Yuna was not just being cruel, she was exposing the fundamental lie he had been living. She was showing Zola the gilded cage and reminding Jinwoo that he was still the monster inside it. He grabbed Yuna's arm, his grip like steel. "That's enough," he snarled. He turned to Zola, whose face was a mask of confusion and hurt. "Let's go," he led her away, leaving Yuna smiling triumphantly behind them. The silence in the car was heavier than any he had ever known. The beautiful evening had been shattered, and shards of doubt and suspicion littered the space between them. "What did she mean, Jinwoo?" Zola finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is your family business?" He looked at her, at the trust in her eyes that was now clouded with fear, and the lie he had been carefully maintaining finally crumbled into dust. The drive back to her apartment was a torment of silence. The questions Zola wasn't asking screamed in the space between them. When he parked, she didn't get out of the car immediately. She just sat there, staring at her hands clasped in her lap. The rain had started again, a soft, mournful tapping on the roof of the car that mirrored the anxious rhythm of his heart. "She was right, wasn't she?" Zola said, her voice small but clear. "There's something you're not telling me. Something big, this was it. The precipice he had been walking towards since the day he met her. He could lie, could create a more palatable story about a ruthless but legal corporate entity, but he knew instinctively that another lie would be the end. The foundation of trust, already cracked by Yuna's attack, would shatter completely. He owed her the truth. The entire, ugly, unforgivable truth. He turned off the engine and faced her, the darkness of the car a confessional booth. "My family is not in corporate business," he began, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his confession. "Not in the traditional sense. We own shipping companies, real estate, nightclubs. But those are just the face of the business. The real work. It's something else." He watched her face, searching for a sign, any sign, of how she was processing his words. Her expression was unreadable, her stillness absolute. "My father was the head of the Bukti syndicate.
And now,
I am," he said the words, letting them hang in the air, toxic and damning. "Mafia.
gangster."
Criminal. He was all of those things. He saw the flicker in her eyes then, not just shock, but a dawning comprehension, as if disparate, confusing pieces of his personality were suddenly clicking into place. His guardedness, his sudden departures, the way he carried himself with an aura of absolute authority and latent violence. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. "Everything you saw tonight," he continued, forcing himself to go on, "the money, the power, the fear in that woman's eyes when I touched her. It comes from that world. A world of violence and intimidation. It's the only world I've ever known. It is who I am," he finished, his chest aching, feeling as if he'd just carved out his own heart and placed it in her hands. He expected her to recoil, to open the car door and run, to look at him with the disgust and fear he so rightly deserved. He had given her every reason to leave. He waited for the verdict, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Zola finally took a deep, shuddering breath. She didn't move away. Instead, she turned her body more fully towards him, her gaze so intense it felt as if she was seeing straight into his soul. "Is it who you want to be?" she asked. The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry, filled with a heartbreaking sincerity. It was a question no one had ever asked him before. He had been groomed since birth to be a successor, not a person with his own desires. His wants, his dreams had been irrelevant. But meeting her had changed that. She had awakened a part of him that wanted more than power, that yearned for the peace he saw in her garden, for the simple warmth of her hand in his. "No," he whispered, the admission a raw, painful truth he had never before allowed himself to acknowledge.
No.
Not anymore. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of fear, he realized, but one of empathy. She was crying not for herself, but for the man trapped inside the monster. She reached out, her hand covering his on the center console. Her touch was not revulsion, but an anchor. "Okay," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. "Okay, Jin-woo." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a starting point. It was a chance. And in the suffocating darkness of his life, that single word was a gasp of pure, clean air. In the aftermath of his confession, a fragile, new honesty settled between them. The easy comfort they had built was gone, replaced by a more sober and profound connection. Zola was quieter, more watchful. She asked questions not about the violent details of his work, but about him, about his childhood, about his father, about the moment he realized he was trapped. She was trying to understand the man, not the Mafia boss. For Jin-woo, this was both a relief and an agony. He had never been so exposed, so vulnerable. He found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, memories of a lonely childhood spent learning strategy games instead of playing with friends, of the immense pressure to be emotionless and strong. Zola listened, absorbing his pain without judgment, offering not absolution, but understanding. He knew he had to change. It was no longer a vague desire, but an urgent necessity. To stay with her, to be a man worthy of her, he had to dismantle the empire he had inherited. It was a task that seemed impossible, like trying to stop a tidal wave with his bare hands. Leaving his world wasn't like resigning from a job. It was an act of treason that would be met with swift and lethal consequences, not just from his rivals, but from his own men who depended on the stability he provided. He started by making small, strategic moves. He began funneling money into legitimate, overseas investments, slowly divesting from the criminal enterprises. He promoted his most level-headed lieutenants and started severing ties with the more volatile factions. Each move was a risk, a delicate step on a web of tripwires. The pressure was immense. He barely slept, haunted by nightmares of what could go wrong, of the danger he was putting Zola in simply by being in her life. One evening, he arrived at the garden, looking exhausted and grim. The weight of his double life was crushing him. Zola took one look at his face, led him to their bench, and placed a cup of warm tea in his hands. "You can't do this alone, Jin-woo," she said gently. "You're trying to carry the whole world on your shoulders. This is my world," he said, his voice raw. "My mess to clean up. I brought this darkness into your life, and I have to be the one to get it out. When you weed a garden," she replied, her voice calm and steady, "you don't just rip out the biggest weeds and expect the soil to be healthy. You have to nurture what you want to grow. You have to plant new seeds. What do you want to grow, Jin-woo?" He looked at her, the love he felt for her a fierce, protective fire in his chest. "A life," he said simply. "With you. A quiet, simple life." He set the tea down and took both of her hands in his. "I am getting out, Zola. For good. It will be dangerous, and it will be ugly. But I'm doing it. I have a plan. It will mean leaving Korea, at least for a while. It will mean leaving everything I've ever known behind." He paused, his grip tightening on her hands. "I am asking you to come with me." It was the greatest risk he had ever taken. He was asking her to abandon her home, her friends, her entire life, for a future with a man who was still tangled in a web of violence. He was asking for a leap of faith, so enormous it seemed insane. She looked from his eyes to their joined hands, her expression serious. She was silent for a long time, and with each passing second, his hope dwindled. Then, she squeezed his hands back, her touch firm and resolute. "Where are we going?" she asked. And in those 4 words, he found his salvation. The fortress had crumbled, the prison had been thrown open, and for the first time in his life, Kwon Jinwoo was truly free.